The highway stretched like a dark ribbon under the moonlight, quiet except for the low hum of Jin-Ho's engine. He hadn't planned to stop, but when the sign for Starlight Oasis flickered into view, something tugged at him. A feeling. Not fatigue, not hunger, just a strange pull. He pulled into the near-empty lot, parking beneath a buzzing light. Inside, the rest stop was dim, quiet. Clean, but tired. A woman stood behind the coffee counter, alone. She looked up as he entered. Pale gray eyes. Calm. Measured. Cold night, she said. Jin-Ho nodded. Coffee, please. Strong. She poured without small talk. When she handed him the cup, her fingers brushed his. Careful out there, she added, voice low. There was something in her tone, not just politeness. A note of warning, or maybe recognition. It stayed with him as he walked back to his truck. Just a cup of coffee, just a passing moment. But something about her didn't sit right. Or maybe it sat too right. And as he turned the key in the ignition, Jin-Ho realized. He wasn't sure if he was driving away from something. Or toward it. That brief moment of warmth, the unexpected kindness from the woman at the Starlight Oasis rest stop, lingered in Jin-Ho's thoughts longer than it should have. Just a simple exchange, a cup of coffee handed over with clear eyes and a quiet word of caution against the cold. Yet, it felt different. A small spark in the usual grind. The next morning, the smell of stale coffee and motor oil replaced the crisp night air as Jin-Ho waited for the mechanics at the logistics center depot to finish the routine maintenance on his rig. He nursed a lukewarm cup in the cramped break room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Jin-Ho. Didn't expect to see you grounded today. Mr. Chen clapped him on the shoulder, settling into the plastic chair opposite with a sigh that seemed more performative than genuine. Chen was a decade older, a veteran driver whose friendliness always felt a mile wide but an inch deep. A necessary workplace colleague, not quite a friend. Just the usual checks, Mr. Chen. Tires, oil, the works, Jin-Ho replied, forcing a polite smile. Chen took a noisy slurp from his own cup. Good, good. Keep the wheels turning, eh? He leaned in conspiratorially, his voice dropping. Say, you ever stop at that Starlight Oasis place? Out on the 15? Jin-Ho nodded slowly, a flicker of unease starting. Yeah, stopped there night before last. Needed coffee. Ah. Then you probably saw her. The quiet girl at the coffee counter? Ilara, I think? Chen's eyes lit up with the unmistakable gleam of fresh gossip. Bit of a strange one, isn't she? Jin-Ho shifted slightly. Seemed all right to me. Quiet, yeah. Quiet like a fox. Chen chuckled, nudging Jin-Ho's arm. Word is, she's not just serving coffee. Folks have seen her, slipping out the back late at night. Real late. Meaning someone in the shadows behind the building. He lowered his voice further, relishing the delivery. Doesn't sound like employee business, if you catch my drift. Something shady. The word hung in the air, thick and unpleasant. Shady? That didn't track with the calm, almost serene woman who'd served him coffee. Jin-Ho felt an immediate urge to dismiss it. Just typical breakroom rumors, the kind that festered in places like this, fueled by boredom and speculation. People always talked. Especially about those who kept to themselves. Sounds like typical gossip, Mr. Chen, Jin-Ho said, aiming for casual dismissal. Maybe she just needed some air. Air? At 2 a.m.? Meeting someone? Chen grinned, clearly enjoying the skepticism. Nah, there's more to it. Always is with the quiet ones. Despite his outward rejection, a seed of doubt took root in Jin-Ho's mind. It was unwelcome, an annoying itch beneath his cynicism. He prided himself on reading people, a skill honed over 15 years on the road, dealing with every type imaginable. But hadn't he been wrong before? Terribly wrong? He vaguely recalled a time years ago, a situation where he jumped to conclusions about someone based on whispers, only to find out later how skewed the story was. Or was it the other way around? Had he been the subject of unfair suspicion? The memory was hazy, but the feeling it left, a knot of regret and wariness, was sharp. This internal conflict chafed. His brief, positive impression of the rest stop worker clashed uncomfortably with Chen's suggestive narrative. He remembered her clear gaze, the simple sincerity he thought he'd felt. Was that just an act? Was his judgment that easily clouded by a tired mind and a single kind phrase? The suspicion, unwelcome as it was, began to burrow in, tainting the memory. Chen, oblivious, launched into another story about dispatch errors, but Jinho barely heard him. The whispers from the break room seemed to follow him out to the garage bay, echoing the low hum of the machinery. The whispers from the break room clung to Jinho like the persistent smell of diesel fumes, unwelcome and hard to shake. Mr. Chen's gleeful recounting of the rumors about Ilara, the quiet rest stop worker, played on a loop in his mind as he drove through the deepening twilight. Slipping out the back, meeting someone shady. He tried to brush it off as petty gossip, the usual chatter of bored drivers. Yet, the seed of doubt had been planted, watered by that nagging memory of past misjudgment. He hated being wrong, but he also hated condemning someone based on hearsay, especially when his own brief encounter had left such a different impression. Was she merely reserved, or was she hiding something? The question gnawed at him as the miles dissolved beneath his wheels. Hours later, the needle on his fuel gauge dipped towards the quarter mark. Coincidence, or perhaps a subconscious pull, brought the familiar green and white sign of the Starlight Oasis into view. He hadn't planned on stopping here again so soon. Not really. But the truck needed fuel, and his legs needed stretching. It was a practical decision. Mostly. Pulling into the sprawling, mostly empty parking lot felt different this time. The cheerful glow of the main building seemed less inviting under the heavy cloak of night. Around 8 p.m. now, the sky bruised purple at the horizon. Instead of parking near the entrance, he found himself veering towards the edge of the lot, closer to the service area at the rear, partially obscured by dumpsters and overgrown shrubs. He told himself it was just a less crowded spot. He killed the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the distant drone of highway traffic. He got out, stretching his back, the cool night air doing little to clear the unease that prickled his skin. His gaze, despite his best intentions, drifted towards the back of the brightly lit convenience store and coffee shop building. Towards the shadows. Towards the area Chen's rumors had painted with suspicion. A single, bare bulb cast a sickly yellow halo over a metal service door, likely the employee entrance Chen's informant had mentioned. Nothing. Just flickering fluorescent lights visible through a grimy window pane further down. He unscrewed his fuel cap, the rhythmic click of the pump nozzle echoing slightly in the stillness. Just get gas, grab a soda, get back on the road. Forget the gossip. But his eyes kept flicking back to that rear area during the slow crawl of the fuel gauge. It was an involuntary act, an itch demanding to be scratched. This forced observation felt intrusive, voyeuristic. He shifted uncomfortably. What was he even looking for? Proof? Of what? That a woman sometimes stepped outside her workplace? It was ridiculous. He was letting Chen's cheap talk get to him. He finished fueling, replaced the cap, and leaned against the cool metal of his truck, deciding against going inside just yet. Maybe 5 more minutes of quiet. And then, movement. From the corner of his eye, he saw the metal service door creak open. A figure emerged, silhouetted against the faint light spilling from inside. Even from this distance, Jinho recognized the slight build, the way she moved. Ilara. She stepped out cautiously, pulling the door almost shut behind her, then paused, turning her head slowly, scanning the deserted employee parking spaces and the deeper shadows beyond the reach of the security light. Satisfied, or perhaps resigned, she walked a few paces away from the building, stopping near the hulking shape of a large generator unit, partially concealed from the main lot. Jinho instinctively ducked lower behind the bulk of his truck, parts suddenly thudding against his ribs. This felt wrong. He shouldn't be watching this secret meeting. But he couldn't tear his eyes away. His earlier doubt flared instantly into a cold certainty. Chen was right. The thought offered a grim, unwelcome satisfaction. A moment later, another shape detached itself from the dense blackness near the perimeter fence. Much taller, broader. A man. He moved with a heavy confidence, almost a swagger, closing the distance to Alara quickly. A threatening figure, even in silhouette. The contrast in their sizes was stark, immediately setting an unnerving tone. No words reached Jinho across the distance, only the vast, indifferent sounds of the highway. The entire exchange unfolded in a tense, silent pantomime under the inadequate light. The man stopped a few feet from her. Even without hearing, Jinho could feel the aggression rolling off him. He gestured sharply with one hand, a cutting motion through the air, then pointed back towards the building. Alara stood her ground initially, but Jinho saw her head shake, a clear negative. The man took another step closer, invading her space. His posture stiffened, his gestures became more forceful, punctuated. He seemed to be demanding something, insistent. Alara flinched back slightly, shaking her head more vigorously this time, one hand coming up in a defensive or dismissive wave. She looked trapped, cornered between the imposing figure and the generator. Jinho's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just gossip playing out, this felt dangerous. The man's body language screamed intimidation. Was he threatening her? Coercing her? The visual evidence was damning, confirming Jinho's recently planted suspicion, yet simultaneously twisting it into something far more disturbing. A flicker of genuine concern, sharp and unexpected, pierced through his cynicism. He felt a ridiculous, protective urge, immediately followed by self-reproach. What could he do? Interfere? Based on what? A silent movie playing out in the shadows? He didn't know the context, the history. Was this collusion or coercion? The ambiguity was maddening. He felt a profound discomfort, the confirmation of the rumors soured by the palpable tension and Alara's obvious distress. This wasn't some abstract shady deal, this looked like raw fear. The silent confrontation stretched for what felt like an eternity, maybe 5 minutes in reality. Then, as abruptly as it began, it ended. The man made one final, sharp gesture, a dismissal or a warning, Jinho couldn't tell, then turned on his heel and melted back into the absolute darkness from which he'd emerged, disappearing completely. Alara didn't move immediately. She stood frozen for a long moment, head bowed, shoulders slumped. Jinho watched her, his own muscles tight with residual tension. Finally, she seemed to gather herself, cast one quick look back towards the impenetrable shadows where the man had vanished, and then hurried back to the service door, slipping inside and pulling it firmly shut. Silence descended again, broken only by the idling engine of a distant refrigerated truck. Jinho remained crouched by his rig, the scene seared into his retinas. Mr. Chen's words echoed with chilling accuracy. Disappear somewhere alone, meet someone. The rumors were true. At least, the observable parts were. But the why remained shrouded in those oppressive shadows. Was she a victim or a participant? He felt a deep, unsettling wave wash over him, a mixture of vindicated suspicion, profound unease, and that unwelcome stab of concern. He'd seen something he wasn't meant to see, something that felt uglier and more complicated than simple gossip. Starting the engine felt jarringly loud. He didn't go inside for that soda. He just needed to leave. Now. As he pulled out of the Starlight Oasis lot and merged back onto the highway, the image of the two figures locked in their silent, tense standoff refused to fade, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth and 100 unanswered questions churning in his gut. The highway miles did little to dilute the unsettling imagery burned into Jinho's mind. The shadowy figures behind the Starlight Oasis, the silent, tense exchange, it replayed relentlessly, overlaying the hum of his engine and the monotony of the road. Shen's rumors, once easily dismissible gossip, now felt disturbingly prescient. Yet, the image of Alara flinching, her defensive posture against that imposing man, sparked a conflicting current of unease that wasn't just suspicion. Was she involved in something dangerous, or merely caught in its orbit? The ambiguity was a torment. He tried telling himself it wasn't his concern. He was a trucker, paid to haul freight, not untangle roadside mysteries. But the questions lingered, barbed hooks snagging his thoughts. The next afternoon, finding himself inexplicably on the same route back, the familiar green sign loomed again. He could just drive past. Should just drive past. But a stubborn, unacknowledged need to understand? Confirm? Refute? Pulled him towards the exit. He rationalized it. He needed coffee, a proper break this time. The flimsy excuse felt paper-thin even to himself. Parking the rig, he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't just a coffee stop anymore. It felt like deliberately walking back into a complicated situation he should be avoiding. He pushed through the glass doors, the familiar chimes sounding oddly loud. The rest stop was moderately busy, travelers milled about, the air thick with the smell of fried food and disinfectant. Jinho scanned the coffee counter. There she was. Ilara. Wiping down the gleaming espresso machine, her movements efficient and contained. He joined the short line, his usual weary neutrality replaced by a conscious effort to appear casual, an effort that likely made him look stiff and unnatural. His suspicion felt like a physical weight, altering his posture, sharpening his gaze. As he waited, his observation became almost clinical. He noted the layout, the position of the counter relative to the main doors, the corridor leading presumably towards restrooms and employee areas, the faint glimpse of that back service door if one craned their neck from a certain angle. He watched Ilara interact with the customer ahead of him, polite, quiet competence, just as he remembered from his first visit. Yet, beneath the surface, Jinho searched for tells. A flicker of anxiety in her eyes? A tension in her hands? Anything to align with the disturbing scene he'd witnessed. He found nothing obvious, which somehow only fueled his uncertainty. When it was his turn, he stepped forward. An Americano, please. His voice sounded slightly strained, lacking its usual timbre. Ilara looked up. Recognition flickered across her face, subtle but definite. She remembered him. But this time, the faint hint of warmth he thought he'd seen before was absent, replaced by a cool, professional neutrality. As she turned to prepare his drink, Jinho couldn't stop his eyes from drifting again, a quick, furtive glance towards the corridor leading to the back. It was an unconscious reflex, driven by the image of her emerging from that direction into the darkness. He saw her pause, just for a fraction of a second, her hand hovering over the coffee grinder. When she turned back, placing the finished cup on the counter, her gaze was direct, steady, and unnervingly perceptive. The professional mask was still there, but beneath it, something had shifted. She had noticed. She had felt the weight of his scrutiny, the unspoken judgment radiating from him. The air crackled with sudden, awkward tension. This wasn't just another customer interaction. It was a confrontation brewing in the silence. He fumbled with his wallet, pulling out a bill, intensely aware of her unwavering gaze. The mundane transaction felt charged, heavy with misunderstanding. As she counted out his change, her fingers moving precisely, she didn't immediately hand it over. Instead, she held his eyes, her own clear and searching, but now laced with a discernible edge. "Is there something else?" she asked, her voice low and even, yet carrying an undeniable challenge. It wasn't hostile, not exactly, but it demanded an answer. Jinho froze, caught completely off guard. Heat prickled his neck. He opened his mouth, but no coherent explanation formed. How could he possibly articulate his suspicions? "I heard rumors you're shady, and then I saw you arguing with some big guy out back?" The words sounded ridiculous, accusatory, based on nothing more than gossip and a scene he'd watched from afar, interpreting gestures in the dark. The communication breakdown was absolute. He felt trapped between his unsettling observations and the inability to voice them without sounding like a paranoid fool. "No," he stammered, avoiding her direct gaze now, focusing instead on the worn countertop. "No, just the coffee. Long drive." The excuse felt pathetic, hanging lamely in the charged air. Ilara's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. A flicker of hurt shadowed her eyes, quickly chased away by a rising tide of quiet anger and a steely defensiveness. She placed his change firmly on the counter, her knuckles white. "I see," she said, the two words laden with meaning. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping further but losing none of its intensity. It wasn't loud, but it commanded his full attention, slicing through his flustered state. "Look," she began, her gaze unwavering, pinning him in place. "I don't know why you keep staring, or what you think you're figuring out by looking around like that." Each word was deliberate, measured. "Maybe someone told you stories. Maybe you saw something you didn't understand." A deep breath. "But let me be clear." Her eyes held his, filled now with a mixture of wounded pride and defiance. "I am not whatever it is you seem to have decided I am." The words, delivered with quiet dignity despite the underlying pain, struck Jinho like a physical blow. Regret washed over him, cold and immediate. He saw it then, the damage caused by his suspicion, his clumsy judgment based on fragments and whispers. He hadn't just been observing, he'd been accusing her with his eyes, with his entire wary demeanor. He felt small, ashamed of his cynicism, of letting unattributed gossip and a single, ambiguous observation curdle his perception. The potential for a simple, human connection, that brief spark he'd felt initially, had been carelessly extinguished by his own guarded nature. He couldn't meet her eyes. He mumbled something incoherent, an apology, an excuse, he wasn't even sure what. He grabbed the coffee and the change, turning away quickly, the heat still burning his face. He didn't look back as he pushed through the doors and walked rapidly towards his truck, the rest stops mundane noises fading behind the roaring in his ears. Sliding into the driver's seat, he stared at the untouched coffee cup. Foolish. He'd been utterly foolish. Jumping to conclusions, letting rumors guide him, projecting his own jaded expectations onto a stranger. He had acted on suspicion, fueled by incomplete information, and managed only to inflict hurt and invite a confrontation he couldn't handle. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Never again. He bowed then and there to stay away from the Starlight Oasis. It wasn't his place, wasn't his business. He was just a driver. But as he pulled the heavy rig back onto the highway, Ilara's parting words echoed, heavy with the weight of his misstep, "I am not whatever it is you seem to have decided I am." The sting of that quiet accusation promised to linger far longer than any roadside rumor. Jinho tried to stick to his vow. For 2 solid days, he deliberately routed himself away from Highway 15, away from the Starlight Oasis and the uncomfortable weight of his last encounter with Ilara. He focused on the road, the drone of the engine, the endless cycle of loading docks and dispatch calls. He immersed himself in the familiar solitude of his cab, telling himself it was better this way. Keep your head down, stay uninvolved. That was the trucker's code, his code. Yet, Ilara's final words echoed in the quiet moments, a persistent counterpoint to his determined avoidance, "I am not whatever it is you seem to have decided I am." The memory brought a fresh wave of shame, a sour taste he couldn't quite wash away with stale coffee and greasy spoon breakfasts. He'd been clumsy, judgmental, and the regret lingered like grit under his eyelids. It was late evening, maybe 4 or 5 days after the awkward confrontation, when the news broke into his self-imposed isolation. He was parked at a brightly lit truck stop hundreds of miles away, idly scrolling through a news feed on his phone while waiting for his takeaway order. A local headline from back near the Starlight Oasis region snagged his attention, "Cash theft reported at Highway Rest Stop Cafe, insider suspected." His blood ran cold. He clicked the link, his heart hammering against his ribs. The article detailed a significant cash theft from the safe at the Starlight Oasis coffee shop, occurring sometime 2 days prior. Investigators noted the lack of forced entry, pointing heavily towards an inside job. The preliminary report mentioned that the investigation was focusing on staff members with access to the safe combination and keys. Then came the line that made Jinho's breath hitch, the primary focus was reportedly on the employee working the closing shift alone on the night of the crime, Ilara. The circumstantial evidence, the article implied, was mounting against her. She had sole access during the suspected time frame, she knew the procedures. Shock hit him first, a physical jolt that made him drop his phone onto the worn seat beside him. Theft. A real crime. Suddenly, the rumors, the secret meeting, his own awkward suspicions, everything coalesced into a much uglier, more dangerous picture. His mind instantly flashed back to the scene he'd witnessed behind the oasis, Ilara and the tall, threatening figure. The man's aggressive gestures, her defensive posture. Had that argument been about money? Had the man been demanding she commit the theft? Or perhaps threatening her afterward? The ambiguity that had tormented him before now felt terrifyingly significant. A profound moral dilemma seized him, far heavier than the lingering shame. What he saw, it could change everything for Ilara. If she was innocent, if that man had coerced her or even committed the crime himself after threatening her, Jinho's testimony about that clandestine meeting could be crucial. It could corroborate her story, cast doubt on the neat narrative the circumstantial evidence seemed to be building. It could potentially save her from wrongful accusation, from the crushing weight of a system that often relied on the simplest explanation. But reporting it. The very thought sent a wave of anxiety through him. Getting involved meant stepping out of the anonymous existence he cultivated on the road. It meant becoming a witness in a police investigation, maybe even a court case. Hours of statements, endless questions, potential cross-examinations. It meant admitting he'd been lurking in the parking lot, essentially spying on her private, albeit suspicious, encounter. How would that look? Would they even believe him? Or would they see him as some creep, his testimony tainted from the start? For someone like Jinho, who actively maintained distance, whose life was built around transient connections and the protective shell of his truck cab, the idea of willingly inserting himself into such a messy, complicated situation felt deeply repellent. Silence was safer. Silence meant staying invisible. Yet, his conscience screamed. He pictured Ilara's face again during their last encounter, the initial hurt giving way to that flash of wounded pride and defiance. I am not who you think I am. If she was truly innocent, trapped by circumstance and perhaps the actions of that threatening figure, how could he stay silent? How could he live with himself knowing his observation might be the key to preventing a grave injustice, all because he was afraid of getting involved? The memory of his own past misjudgment, that faint echo of being unfairly accused or having wrongly accused someone else, added another layer to his turmoil. He knew, dimly but acutely, what it felt like to be disbelieved. The internal battle raged for another day as he drove, the arguments for silence warring against the insistent pull of his conscience. He felt sick with indecision. Finally, unable to bear the churning uncertainty any longer, he found himself, almost against his will, taking the exit for the Starlight Oasis the next morning. He needed to see. Maybe seeing the place again would offer some clarity, some sign to tip the scales of his decision. The atmosphere was immediately different. The usually bustling coffee corner was dark, the metal shutters pulled down tight. Across the entrance, stretched taut and official, was a strip of yellow police tape. Crime scene, do not cross. The stark visual confirmation of the theft sent a fresh chill down his spine. He walked into the main convenience store, grabbing a bottle of water he didn't need, his ears straining for any scrap of conversation. He didn't have to wait long. Two employees in matching blue vests were talking in low, urgent tones near the magazine rack. Jinho pretended to browse, positioning himself just within earshot. Can't believe it. Always thought she was strange, though, one was saying. Yeah, Maria, right? Kept to herself. Police figure she just took the cash and planned to disappear, the other replied, shaking his head. They said the safe was open clean, no damage. Had to be her, she had the key from closing. Heard the managers freaking out. Prime suspect, they're saying. Poor guy trusted her. Prime suspect. The words hit Jinho hard. The casual certainty in their voices, the easy acceptance of her guilt based on opportunity and her quiet nature, it mirrored the very judgment he himself had been guilty of. The gossip confirmed his fears, the narrative was solidifying around Ilara, trapping her in a web of circumstantial evidence and prior suspicion. The memory of her pained defiance, juxtaposed with the image of the genuinely threatening man in the shadows, finally broke through his hesitation. He couldn't let this stand if he held a piece of the truth, however fragmented. The risk of getting involved suddenly seemed less daunting than the certainty of regret if he did nothing. Back in the perceived safety of his truck cab, Jinho pulled out his phone. His hands felt clammy. He found the number for the county sheriff's department online. For a long moment, his thumb hovered over the call icon. This was it. Crossing the line from observer to participant. He took a deep, unsteady breath, the faces of Ilara, curt, defiant, possibly afraid, flashing in his mind. He pressed the button. The dispatcher's professional voice answered on the third ring. Jinho cleared his throat, his own voice sounding unfamiliar, tight with nerves. Hello, yes. My name is Jinho Kim. I need to report something I might have witnessed. It's about the theft, the crime, at the Starlight Oasis rest stop on Highway 15. He explained, haltingly at first, then with growing clarity, what he had seen that night from the parking lot. He gave the approximate date and time, described the figures as best he could, Ilara emerging, the tall, broad man joining her from the shadows, the argument conducted entirely through aggressive gestures and defensive postures. He emphasized the man's intimidating presence, Ilara's apparent fear or refusal, the way the man had vanished back into the darkness. He didn't editorialize, didn't offer theories, just recounted the visual evidence, the observation he'd kept locked inside. He omitted the part about the rumors he'd heard, focusing only on what he personally saw. The dispatcher took down the details calmly, asked a few clarifying questions, then informed him a detective would likely be in touch to take a formal statement. As Jinho ended the call, a profound silence filled the cab. He had done it. He had thrown his small piece of information onto the scales. Whether it would help Ilara or simply entangle him further, he didn't know. He had stepped out of the shadows, away from the safety of non-involvement, and now waited, with considerable trepidation, for the consequences of his decision. The weight of his conscience felt slightly lighter, but it was replaced by the new, uncertain burden of what came next. The call to the police felt like dropping a stone into a deep, murky pond. Jinho couldn't see the bottom, couldn't predict the ripples. He spent the rest of that day and most of the next wrestling with the potential consequences of getting involved, the uneasy silence in his cab amplifying his anxiety. He'd done what his conscience demanded, spoken up against the weight of circumstantial evidence because of Ilara's defiant words and the memory of that threatening figure in the shadows. Still, the ingrained habit of isolation, of staying detached, warred with the unfamiliar territory of being a witness, of potentially altering someone else's fate. He just hoped he hadn't made things worse. He was performing his pre-trip inspection the following morning at the sprawling logistics center depot, checking tire pressure, fluid levels, the mundane rituals that usually grounded him, when a sharp rap on his passenger side window made him jump. He straightened up, expecting a dispatcher or another driver, but froze when he saw who stood there. It was Ilara. She looked starkly different from the composed coffee shop attendant. Gone was the neat apron and professional comb. She wore a simple, slightly worn dark hoodie, the hood pulled down low against the morning chill, though it did little to hide the exhaustion etched onto her face or the deep, bruised-looking circles under her eyes. Her usual neatness was replaced by an air of profound stress, yet beneath it, her jaw was set with a kind of weary, determined resolve. She looked like someone who hadn't slept, someone pushed to the edge but refusing to break. Jinho felt a jolt of panic mixed with dread. He fumbled with the window crank, rolling it down halfway, the mechanism groaning in protest. Ilara? How did you find me here? Her eyes, though tired, were sharp, searching his face with an unnerving intensity. There was suspicion there, yes, but also confusion, maybe even a flicker of desperation. You're Jinho Kim, right? The driver who called in? Her voice was low, raspy, devoid of inflection. It wasn't an accusation, more a confirmation. He nodded numbly, gripping the edge of the door. Yeah. That's me. Why? The single word was quiet but held immense weight. Why did you report what you saw? And how did you know about that night? He swallowed, the dry morning air catching in his throat. The police, she continued, answering her own question before he could. They took my statement yesterday. Again. They mentioned a witness report came in. A truck driver for Meridian Freight. She gestured vaguely at the logo on his truck door. It wasn't exactly detective work to figure out who might have been watching from the parking lot that night. Her tone held a note of bitterness now, the exhaustion momentarily eclipsed by resentment. The confrontation he dreaded was here, raw and unavoidable. He took a breath, deciding honesty was the only route, however uncomfortable. Look, I was there, he admitted, feeling his cheeks flush slightly. Getting fuel. I saw you come out the back. With him. The tall guy. He met her tired, wary gaze. It didn't look right. He seemed aggressive. Like he was threatening you. Then I heard about the theft. He trailed off, unsure how to articulate the messy tangle of observation, rumor, and his own clumsy judgment. Ilara watched him, her expression unreadable for a long moment. The sounds of the busy depot, air brakes hissing, engines rumbling, seemed to fade into the background. The vast, open parking lot suddenly felt far too public for this conversation. Seeing the strain on her face, the vulnerability beneath the defensive posture, Jinho made an impulsive gesture towards his cab. We shouldn't talk out here. Maybe, come in? Just for a minute? She hesitated, her eyes flicking from his face to the truck cab, then back again. Suspicion warred with exhaustion. Finally, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, she walked around and pulled open the passenger door, climbing heavily onto the seat. The cab, usually his sanctuary of solitude, suddenly felt cramped, charged with unspoken history and volatile emotions. An awkward, heavy silence descended, thick with misunderstanding and the weight of the crime that now hung between them. Ilara sat stiffly, hands clenched in her lap, staring straight ahead through the windshield. Jinho slid back into the driver's seat, closing the door, muffling the outside noise. He didn't know where to start. Apologize again for his earlier behavior? Defend his decision to call the police? He fumbled for the right words, acutely aware of her tense silence. Then, unexpectedly, the memory of his own past surfaced again, not as a vague shadow this time, but as a potential bridge. He had to make her understand why. Ilara, he began, his voice low, hesitant. I need you to know, the reason I called wasn't just because I saw that guy threatening you. Although that was disturbing. He paused, gathering his thoughts, choosing vulnerability over defensiveness. It's because I know how it feels. She turned her head slowly, her eyes questioning, still guarded. A long time ago, Jinho continued, finding the words difficult but necessary, dredging up a pain he rarely acknowledged. Something happened. A mistake at a previous job, blame going around. I was accused of something I didn't do. People talked, pointed fingers. No proof, just suspicion. Like static in the air. And nobody believed me. Not really. Not the people who mattered. He looked down at his own hands, gripping the steering wheel. It's a terrible feeling. Being isolated like that, judged, knowing the truth but having no one listen. It messes with your head. He risked a glance at her. So, when you confronted me the other day, when you said, I'm not who you think I am, it hit hard. Because I'd already judged you based on gossip in one look. Then the news about the theft broke, and how the evidence looked, it just brought all that back. He finally met her gaze, hoping she could see the difficult truth in his eyes. I realized that what I saw, that man threatening you, it might be the only thing that could show things weren't as simple as they looked. I couldn't live with staying silent if you were being railroaded, especially after I'd been so wrong about you myself. His confession, raw and unexpected, hung in the air. He saw a flicker of surprise in Ilara's eyes, then something else, a softening, a crack in the defensive wall. The shared vulnerability seemed to resonate, creating a fragile point of connection in the tense atmosphere. Her shoulders lost some of their rigidity. She took a deep, shaky breath, letting it out slowly. The wary suspicion in her gaze began to recede, replaced by a profound weariness, and perhaps, the beginnings of trust. Thank you, she whispered, the words barely audible. She looked away, out the side window, for a long moment before turning back, her expression now open, weary but resolute. You were right. He was threatening me. And then, the truth came pouring out, a torrent of pain, fear, and explanation held back for too long. The man Jinho had seen, the threatening figure in the shadows, was Marcus, her ex-boyfriend. We were together for 3 years, she said, her voice trembling slightly now. It started okay, but he changed. Became controlling, possessive. Ran up debts, gambling mostly. Expected me to bail him out. She explained how she'd finally broken free over a year ago, moving away, taking the quiet job at the Starlight Oasis specifically to disappear, to build a new, uncomplicated life. But Marcus, desperate and relentless, had tracked her down a few weeks ago. He found me, she choked out, tears welling in her eyes. Showed up demanding money. Huge amounts. Said he owed dangerous people. Said if I didn't help him, he'd ruin me. The threats weren't idle. Ilara explained how Marcus had threatened to expose fabricated stories about her past, how he'd even mentioned using old credit card statements from when they lived together, purchases she'd made with his permission back then, to claim she'd committed fraud if she didn't cooperate now. The scene Jinho witnessed wasn't the first, it was just the latest escalation in Marcus's campaign of terror and coercion. That night, the night you saw us, Ilara continued, wiping angrily at a tear that escaped down her cheek. He was furious. I'd refused again. He told me I'd regret it. That he'd make sure I paid. Then came the revelation of how she believed she was framed for the theft. 2 nights later, the money disappeared. The police think I did it because I closed up alone, I had the safe key and the code. It looks simple, right? The quiet girl finally snaps, takes the cash. She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. But Marcus, he knew the routine. He must have somehow gotten a copy of the key before, maybe lifted it temporarily. Or maybe he forced the code out of me during one of his earlier threats, I don't even know for sure. All I know is, the police found the safe emptied, no forced entry. And the main security camera overlooking the office area? It malfunctioned for about 20 minutes during the night shift. Just long enough. She looked at Jinho, her eyes pleading for belief. He knew how to make it look like me. He probably came back after I left my shift, used the key or code he had, took the money, and disabled the camera feed just long enough. He framed me. Perfectly. Her confession hung heavy in the small space of the truck cab. Jinho listened silently, his earlier suspicion replaced entirely by a wave of protective empathy and simmering anger towards Marcus. He saw the full picture now, the quiet demeanor not as secrecy, but as self-preservation, the fear in the shadows not as collusion, but as genuine terror. He reached over hesitantly, offering the small packet of napkins from his glove compartment. Ilara took one, dabbing her eyes. A fragile sense of relief seemed to wash over her, the relief of finally sharing the unbearable weight of the truth. The charged atmosphere in the cab shifted, the confrontation dissolving into a quiet space of shared understanding. The awkwardness lingered, but it was tempered now by a nascent connection, forged through Jinho's unexpected vulnerability and Ilara's harrowing revelation. I'm so sorry, Ilara, Jinho said quietly, the apology heartfelt this time. Sorry for doubting you. For adding to your burden. She managed a small, watery smile. You didn't know. But, thank you. For calling them. For telling them what you saw. Maybe it will help. Uncertainty flickered in her eyes. I don't know what happens now. Neither did Jinho. But as they sat there in the quiet intimacy of the truck cab, the chaotic noise of the depot outside a world away, he knew he couldn't retreat back into his shell of non-involvement. He had stumbled into Ilara's crisis, and now, bound by his conscience and a newfound empathy, he felt inexplicably tied to its outcome. The climax of the immediate misunderstanding had passed, replaced by the daunting reality of the fight ahead. The raw honesty shared in the confines of the truck cab seemed to hang in the air long after Ilara had quietly departed that morning at the depot. Jinho fulfilled his promise, giving a formal, detailed statement to a detective later that week, recounting the threatening encounter he'd witnessed. He heard through the logistics grapevine that the police investigation shifted focus, aided by his timeline and description, along with inconsistencies found in the rest stop security logs around the time Ilara had mentioned the camera malfunction. News eventually filtered through. Marcus, her ex-boyfriend, was arrested, implicated not only in the theft but also in a string of other offenses. Ilara was cleared. Officially. Jinho felt a profound sense of relief, yet also a strange detachment. He had stepped briefly into her chaotic world, acted on conscience, and now retreated back into the familiar rhythm of the road. He kept his distance from the Starlight Oasis for several weeks, figuring Ilara needed space to heal, to process the ordeal without the awkward reminder of his earlier suspicion and reluctant involvement. He focused on his routes, the miles blurring together, the memory of their intense conversation a quiet undercurrent beneath the surface noise of his life. Still, he found himself wondering how she was doing, if she'd returned to the job that had become a source of such turmoil. One sweltering afternoon in late April, his route took him inevitably down Highway 15. He needed fuel, genuinely this time, and found himself pulling into the Starlight Oasis almost automatically. He scanned the coffee counter as he walked towards the main building, half expecting, half dreading seeing her. The shutters were up, the open sign lit. That was a good sign. Inside, however, a young man he didn't recognize was managing the espresso machine. Jinho felt a pang of disappointment, quickly followed by a wave of relief. She wasn't here, but the fact that the place was operational again suggested things were returning to normal. Maybe she had moved on, found something else. Which was probably for the best, he told himself, ordering a black coffee that tasted disappointingly generic compared to the one etched in his memory. A week later, hauling a load back east, he stopped again, drawn by a curiosity he couldn't entirely suppress. This time, as he approached the counter, his heart gave a slight jolt. Ilara was there. She looked better. Less haunted than when he'd last seen her at the depot, though the experience still lingered faintly in the slight tension around her eyes. She was focused on serving a customer, her movements precise and professional. When she looked up and saw him next in line, a complex mix of emotions flickered across her face: surprise, a shadow of the past awkwardness, but then, something softer. A small, tentative smile touched her lips, and Jinho felt himself returning it, equally hesitant. "An Americano?" she asked, her voice quiet, neutral but not cold. "Yeah. Please," he replied. The transaction was brief, professional, yet carried an unspoken acknowledgement of everything that had transpired. The sharp edges of suspicion and confrontation had been smoothed away by shared truth and his eventual, if belated, act of support. There was a fragile understanding between them now, a quiet rapport born from a difficult shared experience. He found himself lingering a moment longer than necessary before heading back to his truck, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. She was back. She was okay. Over the next month, Jinho found reasons, sometimes legitimate, sometimes flimsy, to make the Starlight Oasis a regular stop whenever his route permitted. Each visit chipped away a little more of the residual awkwardness. Their conversations remained brief, constrained by the flow of customers, often just exchanges about the weather or road closures. But the underlying current shifted steadily towards comfort and familiarity. Ilara started greeting him with a warmer smile, her eyes losing that guarded look. She learned his order, often starting his Americano, black, no sugar, the moment she saw his truck pull into the lot. It became a small, unspoken routine, a quiet marker of their evolving connection. One sunny Saturday afternoon in early summer, Jinho wasn't alone. His 8-year-old son, Leo, a bundle of boundless energy and unfiltered observations, was riding shotgun for a weekend trip to visit his grandparents. As they neared the Starlight Oasis exit, Leo, spotting the familiar sign, piped up from the passenger seat. "Dad! Dad! Can we stop? Get a fizzy drink? Please?" Jinho hesitated for only a second. He felt a flicker of nervousness at the thought of introducing his son, crossing another boundary from anonymous trucker to, well, whatever he was becoming to Ilara. But the idea also held a certain appeal. He glanced at Leo's eager face. "Okay, buddy. But just a quick stop." Holding Leo's small hand, Jinho walked into the rest stop. Ilara was behind the counter, a light V-neck shirt replacing the standard uniform today, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked up as they approached, her usual welcoming smile widening as she saw Leo. "Well, hello there," Jinho said, feeling slightly self-conscious. "Got my co-pilot with me today. Ilara, this is my son, Leo. Leo, this is Ms. Ilara." Leo, never shy, beamed up at her. "Hi. Are you the coffee lady?" Ilara laughed, a genuinely warm, musical sound that softened her features completely. she knelt slightly to be closer to his level. "I guess I am the coffee lady sometimes." "It's nice to meet you, Leo. Are you helping your dad drive today?" "Yep," Leo declared proudly. "I watch the mirrors. And I tell him when the songs are boring." Jinho chuckled, ordering his coffee and a lemonade for Leo. As Ilara prepared the drinks, her interaction with Leo was effortless, filled with a natural warmth that Jinho found himself observing with quiet appreciation. She asked Leo about his favorite truck stops, listened intently to his rambling story about seeing a deer by the roadside, her eyes crinkling at the corners with amusement. Then came the moment Jinho had half expected, half dreaded. As Ilara handed Leo his lemonade, the boy took a big gulp and announced loudly, "My dad says your coffee is the best. Even better than the coffee maker at home. He talks about it sometimes." Jinho felt his face instantly flush. He coughed, trying to subtly nudge Leo. "Okay, buddy, that's enough talk." Ilara, however, just laughed again, glancing at Jinho with amusement sparkling in her eyes. The shared moment, the light-hearted embarrassment caused by Leo's innocent candor, seemed to dissolve the last vestiges of formality or awkwardness between them. It felt easy. Friendly. "Well, I'm very glad your dad likes the coffee," Ilara said, smiling at Leo before turning back to Jinho, her own cheeks slightly pink. "Honesty is refreshing." Jinho couldn't help but grin back, the earlier tension completely evaporated, replaced by a comfortable warmth. "Kids, huh? No filter." "It's charming," she replied softly. They chatted for a few more minutes while Leo happily slurped his lemonade, the conversation flowing more easily than ever before. Jinho learned she was taking some online classes in the evenings. Ilara learned about Leo's obsession with building elaborate Lego cities. It felt normal. Like two people simply enjoying a brief, friendly exchange. As they prepared to leave, Leo waved enthusiastically. "Bye, Ms. Coffee Lady." "Bye, Leo. Drive safe." Ilara called back, her gaze meeting Jinho's over Leo's head with a shared smile. Walking back to the truck, Jinho felt lighter than he had in months. The Starlight Oasis no longer felt like a place marked by suspicion and difficult memories. It was transforming, slowly, into something else. A place of tentative friendship, shared laughter, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of a deeper connection, unfolding gently like the highway stretching out before him. The easy rhythm of Jinho's visits to the Starlight Oasis settled into something comfortably routine over the ensuing weeks of late summer. The initial awkwardness following Ilara's revelation and his own confession had gradually faded, replaced by a quiet, steady warmth. He still stopped for coffee whenever his route allowed, but now the exchange felt different, layered with shared history and a mutual understanding that needed few words. He learned about her online classes in library science. She learned about Leo's triumphs on the Little League field. They were small fragments, shared in brief moments between customer rushes, but they slowly pieced together a picture of two lives tentatively intersecting on the vast, impersonal canvas of the highway. One golden afternoon, sunlight streamed through the large windows of the rest stop, dust motes dancing in the beams. Jinho leaned against the counter, sipping the Americano Ilara had slid towards him with a knowing smile before he'd even fully ordered. There was a lull in customers, a rare pocket of quiet in the usually bustling space. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the only sounds the low hum of the coolers and the distant whoosh of traffic outside. It struck Jinho then, how far they had come from those first encounters fraught with suspicion and misunderstanding. He thought of the lonely, weary man he had been, quick to judge, slow to trust. He looked at Ilara, tracing the faint lines of past stress around her eyes that her present calm couldn't entirely erase, admiring the quiet resilience that had brought her through such an ordeal. He saw not just the efficient barista, but the woman who had faced down fear and false accusation with quiet dignity, the woman whose warmth towards his son had disarmed him completely. The coffee, perfectly brewed as always now, felt warm in his hands, but a different kind of warmth was spreading through his chest, a burgeoning affection mixed with a healthy dose of nerves. This connection, this unlikely friendship forged in the crucible of crisis and vulnerability, felt like it was reaching a natural turning point. The rest stop counter felt too small, too confined for whatever this was becoming. He wanted more. More time, more conversation, away from the constant flow of travelers and the smell of brewing coffee. He cleared his throat, the sound unexpectedly loud in the quiet moment. Ilara looked up from wiping the counter, her eyebrows raised slightly in question. His heart hammered against his ribs. He'd faced down angry dispatchers, treacherous road conditions, and his own prickly conscience, but asking this felt monumentally harder. "Ilara," he began, his voice a fraction unsteady. He paused, took a breath, met her calm, questioning gaze. I enjoy talking with you. When I stop by." He gestured vaguely with his coffee cup. "And I was wondering, well, I was hoping." He stalled, searching for the right words, feeling inexplicably clumsy. Maybe we could get a proper meal sometime? Or something? You know, outside of here?" He finally managed, the words tumbling out in a rush. Instead of just coffee? The invitation hung in the air between them. He watched her face, bracing himself for, he wasn't sure what. Rejection? Polite evasion? He saw surprise flicker in her eyes, widening them slightly. She stopped wiping the counter, her gaze holding his. A slow moment passed, stretching thin with unspoken tension and possibility. Then, gradually, a soft, genuine smile spread across her lips, reaching her eyes and making them sparkle in the afternoon light. She tilted her head almost imperceptibly, considering his words, considering him. "Yes, Jinho," she said, her voice soft but clear, imbued with a warmth that enveloped him. "I'd like that very much." Relief washed over him, so potent it almost made him weak at the knees. A wide grin broke across his face, mirroring hers. The simple acceptance felt momentous, a decisive shift in their story. It was an agreement to step beyond the boundaries of their initial meeting place, to shed the roles of weary customer and watchful barista, and explore the potential for a real connection, a relationship built not on suspicion or crisis, but on the trust and empathy they had carefully cultivated. It felt like a true second chance, for both of them. "Great," he breathed out, feeling ridiculously happy. "That's really great. I'll, call you? To figure out when?" "Okay," she agreed, her smile lingering. He finished his coffee, the taste richer, fuller than before. He thanked her again, perhaps a little too enthusiastically, before heading out towards his truck, his step noticeably lighter than usual. He felt a buoyancy he hadn't experienced in years. Settling into the familiar contours of his driver's seat, Jinho glanced back at the Starlight Oasis. He saw Ilara through the window, already attending to another customer, but he could still feel the warmth of her acceptance, the promise held within her simple yes. He started the engine, the rumble of familiar comfort, but today it felt different, like the start of a new journey, not just another haul. As he pulled onto the highway, the setting sun painting the horizon in fiery strokes of orange and purple, he thought back to that first cold night he'd stopped here, seeking only caffeine, wrapped in his cynicism. He remembered Ilara's unexpected kindness, her quiet caution to take care not to catch a cold. It felt like a lifetime ago. That first brief spark, nearly extinguished by misunderstanding and fear, had somehow survived, nurtured by shared vulnerability, difficult honesty, and the tentative offering of trust. Their connection, improbable and unexpected, forged on the lonely artery of the highway, felt real, substantial. He didn't know exactly what lay beyond the horizon, what the future held for him and Ilara. Their story was far from over. In many ways, this felt like the true beginning. But as he drove towards the fading light, the weariness that usually clung to him at the end of a day was replaced by a quiet, hopeful anticipation, a sense that maybe, just maybe, second chances weren't just things you heard about, but things you could actually find, waiting patiently at an unexpected stop along the road.